One last quick little reminder, this is tutorial 2. It goes with topic 5 regarding data, and we're working with the file data_3_1.sav or the file you created in the first tutorial. This is the last of 3 videos for this tutorial. Enjoy!
So we've got these two histograms. Here are the QQ plots. Here are the box plots that I'm not going to discuss. But I do want to talk about the chart editor for a little bit. I want to show you these two histograms. So males on the left, females on the right. Tell me how these histograms are different from the histograms that SPSS spits out. So obviously they're arranged side by side instead of top to bottom. Can you see a difference? There's some other cosmetic differences, right? I changed the color of the bars. I didn't mess with anything else at this point. The difference that I'm hoping that you will notice is that I've changed the y-axis scale for males. In SPSS, the default is that the top of the y-axis scale is at the top of the graph, right? SPSS wants to make the best use of space, wants to minimize blank space. So the male's y-axis scale goes from 0 to 1, whereas the female y-axis scale goes from 0 to 3 because females actually had many scores, or 3 people who had course satisfaction scores at or near 5.0. Right. But if we had kept the male scores at 1, what it would look like is that there were just a lot more observations from males than there are from females, when in fact there were, I think, 1.5 times as many female participants as male participants. So it's difficult to compare graphs when we have different y-axis scales. So that's something that we need to be really mindful of. All right, if you haven't saved your output file in a while, now is a good time to do so because we've added those descriptives and we added the explore function. So I'm going to do that right now. The next thing I'm going to do is edit the histogram for males to make it look a little bit more like the one on my slide. So I'm going to right click on it. You can double click if you want to activate, but I'm going to edit content in a separate window. Now I'm in the chart editor, so I can alter the graph in a few ways. If I right click again, I can pull up the properties window, which gives me some sort of formatting options. I'm going to change, I don't want the fill. This is actually transparent, but we could make it white if we want. I just clicked on the bars. I'm going to make them black. The fill is black. Let's just for fun make the border red. Fly that. That looks kind of weird. But there it is. It would look boring otherwise. Oh, what did I do before the border? I made it white just so that you can see the difference is where the bars end. Okay. Now, to change the scale of an axis, which is something that we want to do so that the male histogram is similar to the female histogram in terms of y-axis scale, all we have to do is click at any point along that axis, and then in the Properties tab, we go to the Scale tab. Rather than an automatic minimum and maximum, we're going to specify 0 to 3, which is the same scale as the histogram for females. All right, now let's apply, and now that looks very different. Okay, the last thing, how do I get this out of SPSS? Last thing I'm going to show you right now is how do I get this out of SPSS and into something else. Here's an instance where you want to do all of your editing first. So don't export it into Word and then try and modify it. Once I'm happy with it, I can save it, I can export it. I'm just going to save it there. Or I can export it here. And that brings up export output and several options as to what format I want and where I want to save it. So this is output female. So I'm putting it in my regular tutorials folder for this tutorial. I'm going to call it output male and click OK. Oh, and I already have something like that. So I'm just going to call it male 1. And now what it's done, you can see my folder, is it's opened up a Word document with my file in it. So I can copy this, resize it, do anything to the file, but this is just like a picture. So I can't do anything to the scale of the axes or the number of decimal places displayed on the x-axis. I can't get rid of mean and standard deviation. I need to do all of that editing in SPSS. All right. So that's it for Explore for now. We have some more work to do in the chart builder. We're almost done. Now is another good time to save. But before we go on to the chart builder, I want to give you some advice about preparing your practical report. So when those data for the practical report are available, I want to encourage you to take the time, now that you are able to use the Explore function on your key dependent variable or variables. If it ends up being a scale variable, I'm pretty sure it will, but like I said, I'm coming to you from the past. A lot could happen in the next couple weeks. Right? So when you have those data, you might have them by now, which would be great. See if you can open them in SPSS and then ask yourself, how am I going to arrange these data? If I wanted to look at them, would I arrange them in different groups? So look at histograms and QQ plots for 2 or more different groups separately. Would I want to compare one variable versus another in a scatter plot? And after you've used the Explore function, think about what measures of central tendency and dispersion are going to be appropriate for your key dependent variables. And then think about how you might report them. Remember, we had a couple examples today. The next thing we're going to do is move on to the chart builder. In the previous tutorial, we looked at data, we looked at transform. We've spent some time in analyze. We're going to spend a lot more time in analyze. Now we're using the chart builder, which is under graphs. It's the first option. And we just get a little reminder, you can turn this off if you don't want to see it again, that measurement levels need to be set properly, otherwise the options that are available in the chart builder are going to be weird. So it gives you an option to define your variable properties, but I'm happy with all of that. So I'm just going to click OK. And it gives me 2 windows to move over. And a little space, we can either start with what type of graph do we want to produce, or we can start with what type of variables and where are we going to put them. So let's start with a bar chart, but you can see that we can also look at lines, we can make area plots, pie charts, scatter plots, those are going to come in super handy, histograms, box plots, and other things. But like I said, this is an introduction to what is a very flexible and versatile and detailed tool. So let's drag a stacked bar chart. So that's this third option. If you hover over them, it will tell you the names of each of the different types of charts. So let's take a stacked bar chart and put it in the preview. And this tells us that we need to specify what goes on the x-axis, what goes on the y-axis, and how are we going to organize these data. Now, we might use this chart builder to just get a general sense of, is there a difference between the number of males and females in each type of course. So if we wanted to do that, we'd want course of study on our x-axis, and remember the data file that I'm using has different numeric codes, so it's going to appear in a different order than yours. And SPSS reminds us up here that the chart preview is just using example data. So if you look at this and think, but wait a minute, we had more than 3 courses of study, where are the rest of them? Don't worry, they're going to appear when we eventually click OK. Now that we've selected course of study, the count so we've changed the default y-axis to count. So we could change that to look at, for example, course satisfaction scores as a function of course study. That would make things more complicated, right? But we can't have a stacked bar chart unless we're stacking it in a particular way. We were going to look at males versus females, so the stack set color is going to be gender. And it's important that this is a nominal variable because that tells us what to look at. All right, so now we've dragged the x-axis and the stack set color. The y-axis automatically changed to count. If we want to make other modifications before we generate the graph, we can. I kind of like to look at things before I modify them, so I would just click OK and then modify these properties using the chart editor in the output function. So I'm just going to click OK, and ta-da! Now if I want to edit it, I can. That I created with a slightly different data file. The only difference is that in this one I was a little bit smarter and I used the same ordering, so the same value numeric codes for each course of study that Allen, Bennett, and Heritage did. Other than that, this is a default SPSS chart from the chart builder. I want you to think about, what would you change about this graph before you put it into a manuscript that you are submitting for publication, or maybe to a practical report? All right, I want you to pause the video now and make a list of things that you would change, and we'll go over what some of those things might be in a little bit. I want to give you another tip about how you can be working on your practical report now. So as soon as the data for your practical report become available, I want you to think about whether you are going to include a graph of any kind in your results section, and if you are, what that is going to look like. For your key dependent variables, you want to ask, is the distribution normal? Right? Once you've looked at your data, you can ask yourself, is this distribution normal? Am I going to trim it or transform it before I conduct any inferential tests? And you can also be thinking about what measures of central tendency and dispersion you'll report. So even though we haven't covered any inferential statistical tests in detail, you can already be working on your practical report. All right, excellent. So the last thing we're going to do is review a couple of the differences between APA-style figures and SPSS default graphs. Now, for more info on APA-style graphs and tables, I highly recommend this link. Hopefully by now you have these slides. I've provided these slides, so you can just click on that link from that file. Right? When you are including a figure in an APA-style manuscript, you need to ask yourself, is it necessary? Is including the figure necessary to present relevant information more clearly? Is this figure clearer and more economical than describing it in words without the figure? Right? So could I say this in a few words? And if you can say it in a few words, then you probably don't need to include a figure. The other thing that is absolutely required for figures in APA style is that you refer to them in the text of your document. Usually in the results section, but it does not have to be the results section. But it has to be referred to somewhere in the text by a number. So in other words, you need to have a sentence that says figure 1 shows, blah, 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 whatever it shows. Okay. A requirement of an APA style figure is that it has a correctly proportioned axis scale. Now what I mean by that is that it's meaningful to the viewer, right? You don't take up the entire graph. It doesn't go, if you show the minimum value at the bottom of the graph, the maximum value at the top of the graph, it's going to look like changes are big changes, whether they're actually big changes or not. So think about, does this graph allow the viewer to interpret the data honestly? And in particular, if you're comparing across multiple panels in the same figure, so you wanted to show, for instance, a histogram with both males and females, it's very difficult to compare if the two graphs have different y-axis scales. So whenever possible, make them the same. Okay? So any APA-style figure needs to include a caption or a legend that explains all abbreviations and symbols not used elsewhere in the document. So if you want to say crosses are reaction times from individual trials, that needs to be clear. You can't assume that that's somewhere else. And if you have on your axis label or in your legend, because it's shorter, an abbreviation, you need to spell it out. The other thing that people don't always attend to, all abbreviations and symbols that are used elsewhere in a document. So if you have used an abbreviation and you've done your job and spelled the word out and then in parentheses put the abbreviation. So if I want to say fixed interval, parentheses, FI, and I want to type the letters FI instead of writing out fixed interval through the rest of my manuscript, but then I use FI on my x-axis in a figure, I need to specify in the caption for that figure that FI means fixed interval, even though I've used it elsewhere in the document. Those are the APA rules. And you also want to watch out for chart junk, which we would have talked about in lecture 3. We will have talked about in lecture 3. All of those little extra things. Do we need that little mean and standard deviation that's reported in the corner of the graph, or is it sort of nicer and neater if we get rid of it? That kind of thing. Also, APA style to use legibility is always the key, right? So all of these requirements are meant to be functional rather than formal. So don't use just any old sans serif font. So sans serif font is one without the little feet. But legibility is always the key. When this is shrunk down to manuscript size, is someone going to be able to see it? In terms of your practical report, when this gets converted to a PDF and then uploaded to Moodle via Turnitin, is the person marking it going to be able to read that legend or that caption? And if it started out in 8-point font and it gets shrunk down from there because you need it to fit on the page, chances are the answer is no. So be aware of font size and of what type of font. Okay. Last question, what's missing from this document and what would you change? All right, now before you go, I want to encourage you one last time to make sure you have saved your data file if you've made any changes to it. And remember, we calculated those z-scores, z-scores when we did the descriptive statistics, so we probably did change your data file, and also save your output file, again with whatever you are using as part of your naming convention. And that file extension for your output file might be SPV, it might be SPO. Just use whatever is standard for the version of SPSS that you have. All right, so that's it for describing and summarizing data in SPSS. So of course, this is really just the beginning. You're going to continue exploring data and graphing your data as we get into specific techniques for answering different research questions. The next time we're going to be working with some different data sets to conduct non-parametric tests. So the last thing before I go, since this is Beautiful Data Week, I want to leave you with a quote from a statistician, Aaron Levinstein, who said, "Statistics are like a bikini. What they reveal is suggestive, but what they conceal is vital." All right, that's it. Bye for now. A bientôt.